Woke up that morning with a dangerous level of confidence. Not the kind you earn, just the kind you wake up with for no reason. Decided I was going to act like an adult for 24 hours, which already tells you I don't normally do that. I didn't announce it to my wife, because adults don't announce plans, they just quietly disappoint people later. I got out of bed without checking my phone, which felt illegal, like I was skipping a step in the human startup process. I stood there thinking, this be what responsible people feel like all the time, just calm, focused, slightly unaware of reality. I started with chores because that's what movies say adults do. I saw the trash and thought, I can handle this. I tied the bag, felt proud, then realized there were rules I didn't know. There's a right way to take trash out. I found every wrong way first. I used the wrong bag, put it in the wrong bin, and somehow offended the trash can itself. My wife didn't say anything, which was worse. Silence in a marriage isn't peace, it's loading time. I could feel judgment buffering in the other room. Then I decided to handle errands. I told my wife very confidently, I got this, which is a phrase I've never said without consequences. I drove to the store with the energy of a man who thinks responsibility is just confidence with a seatbelt. I didn't make a list because adults remember things. Turns out, adults remember different things than I do. Came back with items we already had, forgot the one thing we needed, and somehow spent more money doing less. That's a skill. Not a useful one, but impressive in its own way. At some point, I tried making a decision. Just one. No consultation, checking, no reading the room. I picked a time, a place, and a plan. The confidence lasted about 6 seconds. My wife asked a follow-up question, and my brain shut down like an old computer. Adults are supposed to have answers, not vibes. It didn't have logic, I had hope. Hope is not strong enough in a marriage. Hope doesn't hold up in court. By the afternoon, I was exhausted. Responsibility takes energy, and I clearly hadn't budgeted for that. I realize most adults aren't calm because they're strong, they're calm because they've accepted defeat quietly. I was still fighting. I was trying to win adulthood in one day like it was a challenge you could speedrun. My wife watched me closely, the way you watch someone carry a glass table down the stairs, not helping, just ready for impact. Dinner came around, and I decided to contribute. That was my next mistake. Cooking looks simple until you're responsible for the outcome. I followed the instructions, but they assumed I knew things they didn't write down. Season to taste, like I know what taste we're going for. I'm not a chef, I'm a guesser. The smoke alarm joined the conversation, and now even the house had an opinion. By the end of the day, I realized acting like an adult isn't about doing everything right. It's about knowing which mistakes are acceptable. I was making rookie mistakes with professional confidence. My wife finally looked at me and said my name in that calm tone that means this experiment is under review. I checked the clock and realized I still had hours left in my 24-hour plan. Suddenly, the idea of being myself again felt like a vacation. I thought about apologizing, but adults apologize strategically. I hadn't learned that part yet. I just stood there, still confident, still responsible, still very unclear on how I was going to make it to midnight without officially being removed from decision-making duties, because the longer I stayed committed to this adult version of myself, the more I could feel that confidence slowly turning into something else. I had a feeling the next choice I made was going to matter way more than the trash ever did. It started with confidence, the most dangerous kind, the kind that shows up without any evidence. Woke up that morning feeling like today was the day everything finally clicked. No alarm panic, no immediate regret, just a calm belief that I had figured adulthood out overnight. Nothing had changed in my life, but I felt different, and I trusted that feeling more than facts. I didn't tell my wife about my plan because real adults don't need witnesses. They just moved through the day quietly being impressive. I stood up straighter, walked slower, and thought, this must be how responsible people walk, like they know where they're going even if they don't. That confidence stayed strong because nothing had challenged it yet. That's the key. Before you do anything, perfect at it. In my head, I was already winning the day. I imagined myself handling problems smoothly, making decisions without hesitation, maybe even giving advice later, like I'd always been this way. I thought confidence was the missing ingredient, like life had been waiting for me to finally believe in myself. Now it could begin. I didn't rush, because adults don't rush, they have time. I had nowhere to be, but I felt punctual anyway. What made the confidence feel real was how quiet it was. I wasn't excited. I was calm. That scared me a little, but I ignored it. Calm felt mature. Calm felt like control. I even nodded to myself once, which in hindsight is not something confident people do. But at the time it felt earned. I thought about all the times things went wrong before and decided that was clearly because I hadn't been confident enough. This time was different. This time I was ready for what I didn't know, but I trusted that clarity would show up eventually. I started mentally organizing my day, not writing anything down because adults don't need lists. Lists are for people who doubt themselves. I believed memory would handle it. I believed responsibility was mostly a mindset. If you feel like an adult, the rest should follow automatically. Assume problems would recognize my confidence and stay away out of respect. That's how I thought it worked. I hadn't tested it yet, but I felt no urgency to do so. The confidence grew the longer it went unchallenged. Every minute without failure felt like proof. I hadn't solved anything, but I also hadn't messed anything up. That felt like progress. I convinced myself this was sustainable. Maybe I had been an adult this whole time and just never noticed. I wondered how many people were walking around unaware they were capable of more. Like me, just one confident morning away from competence. The problem with that kind of confidence is it doesn't prepare you, relaxes you. It makes you generous with promises and casual with decisions. Encourages phrases you shouldn't say out loud yet. Tells you that effort won't be necessary because belief will carry the weight. And right there, before anything actually happened, before the day asked me to prove even one of these thoughts, I felt ready to take on the simplest task, the kind that shouldn't require planning, the kind that every adult handles without thinking. And I remember thinking, finally, this is going to be easy. I don't see how this could go wrong. I mean, honestly, what are the chances? The first task I chose felt safe, almost ceremonial, warm up stretch for adulthood, taking care of something ordinary, something everyone does, seemed like the perfect way to ease into responsibility. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I was just trying to exist correctly. That's when I learned that ordinary tasks are only ordinary if you already know the rules. From the outside, they look simple. From the inside, they are full of expectations no one explains because everyone assumes you already failed at them years ago and learned quietly. I approached the task with confidence and no information, which is a risky combination. I noticed there were options involved that immediately complicated things. There wasn't just one way to do it. There were variations, preferences, what felt like a hidden grading system. I made a choice quickly because hesitation didn't feel adult. Adults commit. I committed to the wrong version. I could tell by the way the situation didn't respond positively. Nothing broke, but something shifted. The atmosphere changed, like the room itself was aware I had skipped a step. What surprised me most was how fast confidence turned into negotiation. I wasn't trying to do it perfectly anymore. I was trying to do it acceptably. That's a big emotional drop for a small task. I found myself adjusting things mid-process, pretending that was the plan all along. I thought about stopping and restarting, but adults don't restart. Restarting feels like admitting there was a first attempt, and I was not ready for that kind of honesty. So I kept going, hoping momentum would count for something. That's when I realized these simple tasks are not about completion, they're about technique. There's a rhythm to them, a sequence you're supposed to respect. Miss one part and the whole thing feels off, even if the result technically exists. I had done the thing, but not in the way it was meant to be done. It felt like clapping on the wrong beat. You're participating, but everyone knows you're the problem. I became aware of being observed, not directly, but in that way where no one is watching, and yet you're somehow failing publicly. That's the pressure of adult tasks. There's no applause, just judgment stored for later. I started mentally preparing explanations I hoped I wouldn't need. I wasn't defensive yet, but I was close. I kept thinking if I moved confidently enough, the mistakes would blur together and look intentional. By the time I finished, I felt tired, which didn't seem fair given how small the task was. That's when it hit me that responsibility isn't heavy, because it's hard. It's heavy because it's specific. There's a right way, and it's invisible until you do it wrong. I stood there looking at what I had accomplished, trying to decide if this counted as success. It wasn't wrong enough to fix, but it wasn't right enough to feel proud. It existed in that uncomfortable middle space where you hope no one asks questions. I walked away from it slowly, like you do when you're not sure if something might explode. I told myself this was just one task, a warm-up, a learning moment. The confidence was still there, but it had shifted. It wasn't loud anymore. It was cautious, quieter, had realized adulthood wasn't about big challenges. It was about surviving a series of small ones without revealing how confused you are. And as I moved on to the next responsibility, I could already feel that each simple task was going to come with its own invisible instructions. And I was still guessing, still committing, still hoping that eventually one of these everyday moments would go exactly the way I imagined it would in my head before I ever touched it. The hardest part wasn't the task itself. It was the quiet that followed. Not loud silence, not dramatic silence, just normal, everyday quiet that somehow felt heavier. My wife didn't say anything, which immediately made me aware that something had been noted. When someone reacts strongly, and where you stand. When they don't react at all, you start replaying everything you just did like it's security footage. I wasn't being yelled at, corrected, or even questioned, and that felt worse. My performance had been evaluated and filed away for later use. She continued with her day as if nothing unusual had happened. That was unsettling. It made me wonder if this was a test I didn't know I was taking. I tried to act normal, which is difficult when you're actively trying to prove you're capable. Every move I made felt like it was being added to an invisible scoreboard. No one announced the points, but I could feel them changing. I couldn't tell if I was ahead or dangerously behind, and that uncertainty made every small decision feel bigger than it deserved. They're smart. I started reading into things that probably meant nothing. A pause before a response felt intentional. A neutral expression felt loaded. Even kindness made me nervous because it felt conditional encouragement given to someone who might not make it. I realize marriage has its own language, and silence is one of the most advanced dialects. It doesn't explain itself. It just sits there, confident that you'll do the work. What made it worse was that I didn't want to ask. Asking would confirm that something was wrong, and I was still hoping I could outpace the judgment by doing better later. I told myself if I handled the next thing perfectly, whatever had been silently recorded would be erased. That's not how it works. In the moment, it felt reasonable. I had faith in a system I didn't understand, which was becoming a pattern. I noticed how calm she was, and that calm felt earned, like she had seen this before. That's when it hit me that I wasn't competing with expectations, I was competing with history. This wasn't just about today. Today was being compared to every other day. I had confidently tried something and misunderstood it. That scoreboard had depth. This was a season, not a single game. I tried to match her calm, which only made me more aware of my effort. Real calm doesn't try. Mine was loud internally. I was aware of my posture, my tone, even the way I walked through the room. I wanted to look like someone who belonged there, like someone who regularly handled responsibility without needing credit. But the more I tried to look natural, the more I felt like I was performing. At one point, I almost explained myself out loud, not because she asked, but because the silence felt like it deserved commentary. I stopped myself just in time, realizing that explaining unprompted is rarely a good sign. Adults don't narrate their intentions. They let results speak. I didn't have results yet, just effort, and effort is invisible in a marriage unless it works. So I kept going, carrying that quiet awareness with me, knowing that nothing had been said, but something had been understood. The scoreboard remained unseen, the points unannounced. Every step I took after that felt like it mattered just a little more than it should. Because somewhere in that silence was a running total. I had no idea how close I was to finding out what it said. There's a moment in every bad decision where it becomes official. For me, it usually starts with the words, "I got this." I don't say it often, and when I do, it's never necessary. No one asked for reassurance. No one expressed concern. The situation was neutral until I introduced confidence out loud, which immediately raised suspicion. "I got this" feels like drawing attention to yourself in a room that wasn't looking at you. It's a phrase that doesn't calm people down, it alerts them. I said it casually, like it was just information, not a promise. My mind, it meant I was willing to handle something. In reality, it sounded like I had already misunderstood the assignment. My wife didn't react right away, which told me everything. There was a pause, just long enough to suggest she had heard this before, maybe even from me, and knew what usually followed. Pause didn't stop me. If anything, it pushed me forward. Once you say, "I got this," backing out feels illegal. What's interesting about that phrase is how fast it locks you in. You can't ask questions afterward without weakening it. You can't adjust the plan without admitting there was no plan. You've drawn a line where confidence is supposed to live. Now you have to stand there. Even if you're wrong, realized immediately that I hadn't thought through what this actually was. This was vague, undefined, already moving. As soon as I started, I could feel the gap between my confidence and my competence widening. Committed publicly, even if the audience was just one person who knew me well enough to recognize a pattern. Every small obstacle felt larger because quitting wasn't an option anymore. The phrase had weight. It had expectations attached. I wasn't just doing a task now, I was defending a statement. I tried to move quickly, hoping speed would look like control. That's when mistakes multiply. Rushing doesn't hide confusion, it highlights it. I caught myself improvising solutions that only existed because I hadn't prepared. Each choice felt like it needed to justify the original confidence, not solve the actual problem. I wasn't fixing anything, I was performing belief. The worst part was realizing halfway through that no one needed me to say, I got this, in the first place. The situation would have resolved itself with, or without my involvement. By stepping in so confidently, raised the stakes for no reason. Now, it wasn't just about whether the task got done. It was about whether I could live up to my own announcement. I became aware of how quiet the room was again. Not judging, that waiting is dangerous. Waiting gives your thoughts space to catch up, and mine were not supportive. I started replaying the moment I said the phrase, wondering why I hadn't just stayed silent. Silence would have kept my options open. Silence is flexible. I got this as a contract. As I continued, I could feel that sentence following me, attached to every move I made. It wasn't just something I had said, it was something I now had to prove. And the more effort it took to prove it, the clearer it became that the phrase itself had been the mistake, because anyone who truly, it doesn't need to say it, anyone who says it is about to find out exactly what this really costs, there's a moment in every bad decision where it becomes official. For me, it usually starts with the words, I got this. I don't say it often, and when I do, it's never necessary. No one asked for reassurance. No one expressed concern. The situation was neutral until I introduced confidence out loud, which immediately raised suspicion. Saying, got this, feels like drawing attention to yourself in a room that wasn't looking at you. It's a phrase that doesn't calm people down, it alerts them. I said it casually, like it was just information, not a promise. My mind, it meant I was willing to handle something. In reality, it sounded like I'd already misunderstood the assignment. My wife didn't react right away, which told me everything. There was a pause, just long enough to suggest she had heard this before, maybe even from me, and knew what usually followed. That pause didn't stop me. If anything, it pushed me forward. Once you say, I got this, backing out feels illegal. And they're smart. What's interesting about that phrase is how fast it locks you in. You can't ask questions afterward without weakening it. You can't adjust the plan without admitting there was no plan. You've drawn a line where confidence is supposed to live. Now you have to stand there, even if you're wrong. Realized immediately that I hadn't thought through what this actually was. This was vague, undefined, already moving. As soon as I started, I could feel the gap between my confidence and my competence widening. I had committed publicly, even if the audience was just one person who knew me well enough to recognize a pattern. Every small obstacle felt larger because quitting wasn't an option anymore. The phrase had weight. It had expectations attached. I wasn't just doing a task now, I was defending a statement. I tried to move quickly, hoping speed would look like control. That's when mistakes multiply. Rushing doesn't hide confusion, it highlights it. I caught myself improvising solutions that only existed because I hadn't prepared. Each choice felt like it needed to justify the original confidence, not solve the actual problem. I wasn't fixing anything, I was performing belief. The worst part was realizing halfway through that no one needed me to say, "I got this," in the first place. The situation would have resolved itself with or without my involvement. By stepping in so confidently, I had raised the stakes for no reason. Now it wasn't just about whether the task got done, it was about whether I could live up to my own announcement. I became aware of how quiet the room was again. Not judging, just waiting. That waiting is dangerous. Waiting gives your thoughts space to catch up, and mine were not supportive. I started replaying the moment I said the phrase, wondering why I hadn't just stayed silent. Silence would have kept my options open. Silence is flexible. "I got this" is a contract. As I continued, I could feel that sentence following me, attached to every move I made. It wasn't just something I had said, it was something I now had to prove. And the more effort it took to prove it, the clearer it became that the phrase itself had been the mistake, because anyone who truly has it doesn't need to say it. Anyone who says it is about to find out exactly what this really costs. At some point, I realized I wasn't using logic anymore. I was using optimism, and those are not the same thing. Logic has steps. Optimism just believes the steps will appear when you need them. I started making decisions based on how much I wanted things to work out rather than how they actually worked. I told myself that intention mattered, that effort counted, that the universe could probably fill in the gaps if I stayed positive. That felt reasonable at the time, mostly because I didn't slow down long enough to test it. Whenever a decision came up, I didn't think it through, I felt it through. I'd look at a situation and think, this seems fine, which is not a measurement system. There was no evidence, no reference point, just a quiet hope that things would align out of respect for my confidence. I noticed I was guessing more than deciding, but I treated the guesses like educated ones, even though there was no education involved. It was all instinct. My instincts were clearly based on comfort, not accuracy. The problem with guessing is that it sounds like thinking if you don't say it out loud. In my head, everything felt structured. Assumed details would be forgiving. I assumed timing was flexible. I assumed people would understand what I meant to do. If the result didn't quite match, that's a dangerous assumption in adulthood, because adults are judged on outcomes, not intentions, and I was leaning heavily on intentions like they were transferable. Every time something didn't go exactly right, adjusted my expectations instead of my approach. I told myself it was close enough that this was how responsible people adapted. What I was really doing was lowering the standard to meet my performance. That's not problem solving, that's self-protection. I wasn't trying to fix the issue, I was trying to avoid acknowledging it. I hoped if I kept moving, no one would ask me to explain why I made the choices I did. I also noticed I stopped asking questions entirely. Questions would have slowed things down, and slowing down felt like doubt. I didn't want doubt. Doubt felt like the opposite of adulthood. Adults are decisive, I thought, which is how I justified making fast, unsupported choices. Reality, adults ask questions all the time. They just ask them before they commit. I was asking them silently afterward, which is much less helpful. Hope became my backup plan for everything. If I didn't know how something worked, I hoped it wasn't important. If I wasn't sure about timing, I hoped flexibility existed. If I made a choice that felt slightly wrong, I hoped no one would notice. Hope covered the gaps where preparation should have been. It felt lighter than responsibility easier to carry, and much less effective. What surprised me most was how convincing hope can be when you want it to work. It speaks calmly. It doesn't panic. It says things like, "This usually works out," and people say that like it's a fact. I started trusting that voice more than logic, because logic required effort and humility, and hope just required belief. Belief is simple. It doesn't ask follow-up questions. The longer I relied on guessing, the more committed I became to the results being acceptable. I needed them to be acceptable because revisiting the decision would mean admitting it was a guess. And once you admit that, everything before it becomes questionable too. So I stayed with it, adjusting explanations in my head, preparing justifications I hadn't been asked for yet, still optimistic, still guessing, still telling myself that this is probably how everyone does it, even though a part of me knew that the calm confidence I was trying to project was built entirely on hope, and hope was starting to feel very thin as a strategy the longer the day went on. By the end of it, nothing had been resolved, and that was somehow the most honest part of the day. I didn't have a breakthrough, learn a lesson I could summarize cleanly, and I definitely didn't walk away improved. What I had was awareness, which sounds useful until you realize it doesn't actually fix anything. I knew more about my limits, but knowing them didn't move them. It just made me more careful around them. Like furniture you keep bumping into even after you memorize where it is. Became aware that adulthood isn't a finish line you cross. It's a moving target that adjusts every time you get close. The moment you think you understand it, the rules change slightly, just enough to remind you that you're still guessing. I could feel myself wanting credit for trying, and that's when I realized trying is assumed. No one applauds effort at this stage. Effort is the entry fee. Results are the only thing that counts. I didn't have anything impressive to show for the energy I'd spent all day being intentional. What bothered me most wasn't failure. It was how familiar everything felt. I had been here before, standing in the same confusion with slightly better posture. I recognized the rhythm now. The confidence, the commitment, the quiet recalculations, the internal negotiations. This wasn't a bad day. It was a normal one. Just paid attention to it for once. That awareness didn't make it easier. It made it heavier, because now I knew there was no version of this where things suddenly become simple. I noticed my instincts hadn't improved. They just become quieter. Instead of reacting loudly, I hesitated internally. Instead of being obviously wrong, I was subtly uncertain. That felt like progress, but I wasn't sure it was. It felt like the kind of improvement only the person experiencing it can see, which makes it difficult to explain or defend. I wanted to say, I'm better than I was this morning, but I didn't know how to prove that without sounding like I was asking for patience. There was also no moment where someone stepped in and said, "Okay, that's enough. You've learned what you needed to learn." Life doesn't do that. It just keeps presenting situations at the same speed, regardless of whether you're ready. I realized that waiting to feel capable is not a strategy. Feeling capable is usually something that happens after the fact, when it's too late to be useful. I thought about all the decisions I didn't make because I was unsure, all the ones I did make because I didn't want to appear unsure. Neither felt right. Somewhere in between was probably the correct approach, but it wasn't labeled. There was no sign pointing to it. You're just expected to recognize it when you see it, which assumes you've seen it before. As the day continued, I understood that there wouldn't be a clean ending to this experiment. No moment where I could officially stop and return to being comfortable. This wasn't a challenge I could complete. It was just a closer look at something I'd already been doing, badly, quietly, and repeatedly. The unsettling part wasn't that I hadn't mastered adulthood. It was realizing that mastery might not exist at all. Maybe the goal isn't to get it right, but to keep moving forward without needing things to wrap up neatly. Because the moment you expect resolution is usually the moment something else comes up that needs your attention. You're right back in it, still aware, still unfinished, still figuring out what the next move should be before anyone notices you're hesitating again. So, after 24 hours of being responsible, I realized a few things. First, adults aren't calm because they have it together. They're calm because they've accepted quietly that most things are going to go wrong anyway. Second, saying, I got this is basically a contract for chaos, and you should never, ever sign it without reading the fine print. Finally, marriage is like a quiet scoreboard. You never know how you're doing until the results hit. Sometimes the only way to survive it is to smile, nod, and pretend you meant to do it all along. By the end of the day, I wasn't an adult. I was just a guy who had survived 24 hours of trying, slightly bruised in ego, but mostly still married, which honestly felt like a win. That's how I learned that acting like an adult might be less about what you do and more about not completely losing track of who you already are while you're trying.